I've spent 30 years of my life as a land surveyor, which means I've spent 30 years looking at the world through a lens of absolute, unyielding precision because in my line of work, an inch isn't just an inch. It's a lawsuit, a boundary war, or the difference between a house standing on solid ground or a neighbor's flower bed. And after 3 decades of measuring everyone else in Oppo's dreams, I finally decided it was time to measure my own. People think land is just dirt, but to a man like me, especially a man who had just watched his 30-year marriage dissolve into a stack of cold, stapled legal papers, land is the only thing that doesn't lie to you. It doesn't wake up one morning and decide it doesn't in Oppo's love you anymore. It just sits there, patient and grounding, waiting for you to come home. I found my sanctuary in a remote corner of Clear Creek County, Oregon. 7 acres of untouched timber, wild ferns, and a stream that sounded like silver bells over smooth stones, and I bought it at a tax auction for a price that felt like a gift from the universe. A place where I could finally build a small, off-grid cabin and disappear into the silence for a while. The day I closed on that property, I spent 8 hours out there with my transit and my steel rods, driving those markers deep into the rocky soil with a sledgehammer, sweating through my shirt in the crisp mountain air and feeling, for the first time in a decade, like I was actually standing on something that belonged to me, something no one could take away. I mapped every topographical rise, every ancient cedar, and every GPS coordinate with the kind of obsessive detail only a professional surveyor can muster, because I knew this land was going to be my salvation, the place where I'd rebuild my life brick by brick, or more accurately, log by log. But life, as I've learned the hard way, has a sick sense of humor, and right after I'd finished my preliminary site prep, a massive infrastructure contract came across my desk, a 3-month gig mapping underground utilities in Northern California that paid more than I usually made in a year, and since I needed the cash to fund my retirement dream, I packed my gear, took one last look at my empty, beautiful forest, and hit the road. The work in California was grueling, 16-hour days spent in dusty trenches and cramped utility tunnels, but I kept my sanity by looking at the photos of my land on my phone every night before bed, imagining the porch I'd build and the way the fog would roll off the creek in the mornings, until one Tuesday afternoon, about 10 weeks into the job, my phone buzzed with a message from an old local pilot friend named Silas who lived near my property and liked to fly his Cessna over the ridge, just to see the elk. The message was just a link to a private cloud folder with a note that said, and quote, "Hey Eli, thought you'd want to see how the neighborhood is changing," end quote. And when I opened that file, my heart didn't in Oppo's just sink. It stopped. The video was a high-resolution aerial sweep of my valley, and right where my quiet clearing should have been, right where I'd spent a week sweating over survey pins, sat a sprawling, 3-story Scandinavian modern monstrosity of glass and steel, complete with a paved circular driveway, a guest house, and a massive infinity pool that seemed to be mocking me with its shimmering blue surface. I didn't in Oppo's blink, I didn't in Oppo's breathe. I just stared at the screen until my eyes crossed, replaying the footage over and over, looking for some mistake, some sign that Silas had flown over the wrong ridge. But then I saw it. At the very edge of the new manicured lawn, partially hidden by a fresh layer of expensive sod, was one of my survey markers, the one I'd painted bright orange and driven 3 feet into the ground. And it was still there, a tiny, defiant scream for justice in a sea of stolen luxury. I didn't in Oppo's call the police, I didn't in Oppo's call a lawyer. I just walked over to my foreman, told him I was quitting effective immediately, threw my equipment into the back of my Raptor, and started the 14-hour drive back to Clear Creek with a cold, vibrating fury in my bones that felt like a physical weight behind my ribs. I rolled into the valley just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the Cascades, the air smelling of damp earth and wood smoke, but the familiar gravel turn-off to my property was gone, replaced by a sleek, asphalt private road guarded by a black wrought iron gate with a gold leaf plaque that read, and quote, "The Heights at Clear Creek, private HOA, authorized personnel only," end quote. I sat in my truck, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at that gate like it was a personal insult because I knew for a fact there was no HOA within 20 miles of this ridge, and as I stepped out, my boots crunching on the pristine gravel, I saw a laminated notice zip-tied to the bar stating that the parcel had been, in quote, annexed, in quote, by the association due to abandonment and lack of maintenance. I was reaching for my crowbar when a white Range Rover pulled up on the other side of the gate, the window sliding down with a quiet, expensive hum to reveal a woman who looked like she'd been born in a country club and raised on a diet of pure entitlement. Her name was Beatrice Vane, and she had that perfectly coiffed platinum blonde hair that stayed in place even in a gale. And she looked at me, a dusty surveyor in a flannel shirt and work boots, with the kind of pity you'd give a stray dog you were about to call animal control on. When I told her she was standing on my land, she didn't oppose. To even flinch, she just gave me a thin, tight-lipped smile and said, and quote, "I think you're mistaken, sir. This entire ridge was legally acquired by the Heights Association last year when the previous owners failed to respond to our notices, and as the president of this board, I can assure you that everything here is quite official." End quote. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, a dry, dangerous sound, and I held up the original deed I'd pulled from my glove box, but she didn't oppose. To even look at it, she just adjusted her designer sunglasses and told me that if I had a grievance, I could take it up with their legal team. But until then, I was trespassing on private property, and she'd be happy to call the sheriff if I didn't oppose. T moved my, quote, industrial vehicle, quote, away from their entrance. I didn't oppose. T argue I didn't oppose. T shout I just looked her dead in the eye and said, quote, "Beatrice, you build a palace on a foundation of lies, and I'm the guy who knows exactly where the cracks are," end quote. And then I got back in my truck and drove straight to the county records office. The clerk there, a woman named Martha who had been filing deeds since the Carter administration, recognized me immediately and looked like she'd seen a ghost when I asked to see the annexation papers for my lot. And as she laid the folder out on the counter, I saw it. The signature of the notary who had verified the transfer was a man named Arthur Sterling, who I knew for a fact had been buried in the local cemetery since 2021. This was an oppose. T just a mistake or a boundary dispute. It was a massive, high-stakes fraud, a calculated land grab orchestrated by someone who thought I was a ghost who would never come back to haunt them. And as I dug deeper, I found that the construction permits for the mansion weren't oppose, even in the HOA's name. They were under a shell company called, end quote, Vane Development Group, end quote, owned by Beatrice's 24-year-old son, Julian. The pieces started falling into place like a row of lethal dominoes. Beatrice was an oppose. T just the HOA president. She was the architect of a scheme to use homeowner dues from the small, legitimate development at the base of the hill to fund a luxury estate on my stolen land, which she then intended to sell for a $3 million profit before anyone realized the dirt underneath it was an oppose. T hers. I spent the next 48 hours living out of my truck, but I was an oppose. T sleeping, I was working. I used my surveyor in oppose. S knowledge to bypass their security perimeter through a steep ravine they deemed, end quote, unbuildable, end quote, and I planted a dozen high-definition solar-powered trail cameras around the house, the pool, and the gate. I wanted to see how the, end quote, other half, end quote, lived on my property, and what I caught was better than any reality show. I saw HOA-funded crews installing $5,000 outdoor kitchen setups. I saw Beatrice and Julian clinking champagne glasses on my porch. And most importantly, I caught them at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, thinking they were alone in the dark. The footage was infrared but crystal clear. It showed Beatrice in a tracksuit and Julian in a hoodie, using a mini excavator to systematically locate and rip out my original steel survey pins, the ones I'd driven into the ground with such hope, and they were laughing as they tossed them into the back of an ATV like they were cleaning up trash. That was the moment it stopped being about land and started being about blood, because they weren't an oppose. T just stealing my property, they were trying to erase the very evidence that I'd ever existed on that mountain, and they had no idea that I was watching the whole thing from a motel room 6 miles away, saving every frame to 3 different cloud servers. The next day was the, end quote, grand opening, end quote, an open house for the estate, a catered affair with local socialites and potential buyers from the city, and I decided it was time to RSVP in person. I waited until the driveway was full of luxury cars and Beatrice was mid-speech near the infinity pool, telling a group of investors about the, end quote, untouched heritage, end quote, of the land before I walked right through the front door, wearing my mud-caked boots and carrying a massive, oversized architectural plot of the original county survey. The room went silent as I marched through the marble foyer, the smell of expensive appetizers and perfume clashing with my scent of diesel and pine. And when Beatrice saw me, her face went a shade of gray that I didn't in Oppo's. No human skin could achieve. I didn't in Oppo's. Wait for her to speak. I walked right up to the lead investor, a guy in a suit that cost more than my first truck, and I laid the map out on the hand-carved mahogany table, right next to the tray of caviar. End quote. Beautiful house, end quote. I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, end quote. It's a real shame it's built on a felony, because this map right here shows the legal boundary of Parcel 88, which I happen to own, and this folder here contains the death certificate of the notary, who supposedly signed this land over to the Vacant Group 2 years after he was buried. End quote. You could have heard a pin drop on the Italian tile, and as the investors started murmuring and pulling out their phones, I turned to Beatrice, who was trembling so hard her champagne glass was rattling against her rings, and I whispered, end quote, I told you I knew where the cracks were, Beatrice, end quote. The fallout was instantaneous. The buyers vanished like smoke, the real estate commission pulled the listing within the hour, and by sunset, the local sheriff, a man I'd known for years who was absolutely fuming that this had happened on his watch, was serving a search warrant on the Vacant Development Group's office. But the real kicker, the thing that really sent Beatrice's world into a tailspin, was when the legitimate members of the HOA at the bottom of the hill found out that their dues, money they'd paid for road repairs and snow plowing, had been funneled into the plumbing and electrical work for Beatrice's private mountain retreat. It wasn't an Oppo's, just a land dispute anymore. It was a full-scale revolt, and by the time the emergency court hearing rolled around 3 weeks later, Beatrice had been ousted from the board, Julian was facing felony charges for evidence tampering, and the entire, end quote, Heights, end quote, association was being sued by its own members. In the courtroom, I sat across from Beatrice, who looked like she'd aged a decade in 20 days, her designer clothes replaced by a muted, desperate-looking suit, and she had to sit there and listen as the judge, a no-nonsense woman who had no patience for white-collar thieves, reviewed the trail cam footage of them pulling up my pins. The judge didn't end Oppo's. Just rule in my favor. She went for the jugular, stating that since the construction was performed with, end quote, malicious intent, end quote, and, end quote, documented fraud, end quote, the structure itself, in its entirety, was deemed an, end quote, encroachment of permanent fixture, end quote, that now belonged to the owner of the land. Because the Vacant Group had acted in bad faith, they weren't into Oppo's. Entitled to a single penny of compensation for the materials or labor. They had essentially built me $1 million mansion for free as a penalty for trying to steal my dirt. I walked out of that courthouse into the bright Oregon sun, feeling the weight of the last 3 months finally lift off my shoulders. But as I stood by my truck, I saw Beatrice standing by the curb, waiting for a car that wasn't Oppo's. Coming, and for a second I felt a flicker of something like pity until I remembered the image of her laughing while she threw my survey pins into the trash. I went back to my land next day, but it felt different. The silence was gone, replaced by the humming of the high-end HVAC system and the clicking of the security gate I now held the code to, and as I stood on the massive wraparound deck, looking out over the valley, I realized I had a choice to make. I could live in this glass and steel monument to someone else in Oppo's. Greed, or I could tear it down and go back to my original plan for a small, humble cabin, and honestly, there's a part of me that still wants that quiet little shack by the creek. But then I look at the sign I had made for the end of the driveway, a heavy, rustic piece of timber with the words, end quote, Eli's Justice, end quote, burned into the wood, and I think about the look on Beatrice's face every time she has to drive past this ridge on her way to her much smaller, much more legal home at the bottom of the hill. So now I'm curious, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you keep the house as a trophy of a war you never asked for, or would you bulldoze the whole thing just to have the peace and quiet you originally paid for? Some of my neighbors think I'm being spiteful by staying, while others say it's the ultimate win for the little guy, but I think the real question is about what, end quote, home, end quote, actually means. Is it the walls around you or the ground you're standing on? Drop a comment and tell me if you think I should keep the mansion or start over from scratch. And let's talk about whether justice is really served if you end up with something you never want in the first place. I'll be here, sitting on my stolen porch, waiting to see what you think.